teaching002. Monday, August 7, 1961. I arrived at Don Juan's house in Arizona about 7 o'clock on Friday night. 5 other Indians were sitting with him on the porch of his house. I greeted him and sat waiting for them to say something. After a formal silence, one of the men got up, walked over to me, and said, "Buenas noches." I stood up and answered, "Buenas noches." Then all the other men got up and came to me, and we all mumbled buenas noches and shook hands, either by barely touching one another's fingertips or by holding the hand for an instant and then dropping it quite abruptly. We all sat down again. They seemed to be rather shy, at a loss for words, although they all spoke Spanish. It must have been about 7:30 when suddenly they all got up and walked towards the back of the house. Nobody had said a word for a long time. Don Juan signaled me to follow and we all got inside an old pickup truck parked there. I sat in the back with Don Juan and 2 younger men. There were no cushions or benches and the metal floor was painfully hard, especially when we left the highway and got onto a dirt road. Don Juan whispered that we were going to the house of one of his friends who had 7 mezcalitos for me. I asked him, "Don't you have any of them yourself, Don Juan?" "I do, but I couldn't offer them to you. You see, someone else has to do this." "Can you tell me why?" "Perhaps you are not agreeable to him and he won't like you, and then you will never be able to know him with affection, as one should, and our friendship will be broken." "Why wouldn't he like me? I have never done anything to him." "You don't have to do anything to be liked or disliked. He either takes you, or throws you away." "But, if he doesn't take me, isn't there anything I can do to make him like me?" The other 2 men seemed to have overheard my question and laughed. "No. I can't think of anything one can do," Don Juan said. He turned half away from me and I could not talk to him anymore. We must have driven for at least an hour before we stopped in front of a small house. It was quite dark, and after the driver had turned off the headlights I could make out only the vague contour of the building. A young woman, a Mexican, judging by her speech inflection, was yelling at a dog to make him stop barking. We got out of the truck and walked into the house. The men mumbled buenas noches as they went by her. She answered back and went on yelling at the dog. The room was large and was stacked up with a multitude of objects. A dim light from a very small electric bulb rendered the scene quite gloomy. There were quite a few chairs with broken legs and sagging seats leaning against the walls. 3 of the men sat down on a couch, which was the largest single piece of furniture in the room. It was very old and had sagged down all the way to the floor. In the dim light it seemed to be red and dirty. The rest of us sat in chairs. We sat in silence for a long time. One of the men suddenly got up and went into another room. He was perhaps in his 50s, tall, and husky. He came back a moment later with a coffee jar. He opened the lid and handed the jar to me. Inside there were 7 odd-looking items. They varied in size and consistency. Some of them were almost round, others were elongated. They felt to the touch like the pulp of walnuts, or the surface of cork. Their brownish color made them look like hard, dry nutshells. I handled them, rubbing their surfaces for quite some time. "This is to be chewed, esto se mezca," Don Juan said in a whisper. I had not realized that he had sat next to me until he spoke. I looked at the other men, but no one was looking at me. They were talking among themselves in very low voices. This was a moment of acute indecision and fear. I felt almost unable to control myself. "I have to go to the bathroom," I said to him. "I'll go outside and take a walk." He handed me the coffee jar and I put the peyote buttons in it. I was leaving the room when the man who had given me the jar stood up, came to me, and said he had a toilet bowl in the other room. The toilet was almost against the door. Next to it, nearly touching the toilet, was a large bed which occupied more than half of the room. The woman was sleeping there. I stood motionless at the door for a while, then I came back to the room where the other men were. The man who owned the house spoke to me in English. "Don Juan says you're from South America. Is there any mezcal there?" I told him that I had never even heard of it. They seemed to be interested in South America and we talked about the Indians for a while. Then one of the men asked me why I wanted to eat peyote. I told him that I wanted to know what it was like. They all laughed shyly. Don Juan urged me softly, chew it, mezca, mezca." My hands were wet and my stomach contracted. The jar with the peyote buttons was on the floor by the chair. I bent over, took one at random, and put it in my mouth. It had a stale taste. I bit it in two and started to chew one of the pieces. I felt a strong, pungent bitterness. In a moment my whole mouth was numb. The bitterness increased as I kept on chewing, forcing an incredible flow of saliva. My gums and the inside of my mouth felt as if I had eaten salty, dry meat or fish, which seems to force one to chew more. After a while I chewed the other piece and my mouth was so numb I couldn't feel the bitterness anymore. The peyote button was a bunch of shreds, like the fibrous part of an orange or like sugar cane, and I didn't know whether to swallow it or spit it out. At that moment the owner of the house got up and invited everybody to go out to the porch. We went out and sat in the darkness. It was quite comfortable outside, and the host brought out a bottle of tequila. The men were seated in a row with their backs to the wall. I was at the extreme right of the line. Don Juan, who was next to me, placed the jar with the peyote buttons between my legs. Then he handed me the bottle, which was passed down the line, and told me to take some of the tequila to wash away the bitterness. I spat out the shreds of the first button and took a sip. He told me not to swallow it, but to just rinse out my mouth with it to stop the saliva. It did not help much with the saliva, but it certainly helped to wash away some of the bitterness. Don Juan gave me a piece of dried apricot, or perhaps it was a dried fig. I couldn't see it in the dark, nor could I taste it, and told me to chew it thoroughly and slowly, without rushing. I had difficulty swallowing it, it felt as if it would not go down. After a short pause the bottle went around again. Don Juan handed me a piece of crispy dried meat. I told him I did not feel like eating. "This is not eating," he said firmly. The pattern was repeated 6 times. I remember having chewed 6 peyote buttons when the conversation became very lively, although I could not distinguish what language was spoken. The topic of the conversation, in which everybody participated, was very interesting, and I attempted to listen carefully so that I could take part. But when I tried to speak I realized I couldn't, the words shifted aimlessly about in my mind. I sat with my back propped against the wall and listened to what the men were saying. They were talking in Italian, and repeated over and over one phrase about the stupidity of sharks. I thought it was a logical, coherent topic. I had told Don Juan earlier that the Colorado River in Arizona was called by the early Spaniards El Rio de los Tizones, the river of charred wood, and someone misspelled or misread Tizones, and the river was called El Rio de los Tiburones, the river of the sharks. I was sure they were discussing that story, yet it never occurred to me to think that none of them could speak Italian. I had a very strong desire to throw up, but I don't recall the actual act. I asked if somebody would get me some water. I was experiencing an unbearable thirst. Don Juan brought me a large saucepan. He placed it on the ground next to the wall. He also brought a little cup or can. He dipped it into the pan and handed it to me, and said I could not drink but should just freshen my mouth with it. The water looked strangely shiny, glossy, like a thick varnish. I wanted to ask Don Juan about it and laboriously I tried to voice my thoughts in English, but then I realized he did not speak English. I experienced a very confusing moment, and became aware of the fact that although there was a clear thought in my mind, I could not speak. I wanted to comment on the strange quality of the water, but what followed next was not speech, it was the feeling of my unvoiced thoughts coming out of my mouth in a sort of liquid form. It was an effortless sensation of vomiting without the contractions of the diaphragm. It was a pleasant flow of liquid words. I drank. and the feeling that I was vomiting disappeared. By that time all noises had vanished and I found I had difficulty focusing my eyes. I looked for Don Juan, and as I turned my head I noticed that my field of vision had diminished to a circular area in front of my eyes. This feeling was neither frightening nor discomforting, but, quite to the contrary, it was a novelty. I could literally sweep the ground by focusing on one spot and then moving my head slowly in any direction. When I had first come out to the porch I had noticed it was all dark except for the distant glare of the city lights. Yet within the circular area of my vision everything was clear. I forgot about my concern with Don Juan and the other men, and gave myself entirely to exploring the ground with my pinpoint vision. I saw the juncture of the porch floor and the wall. I turned my head slowly to the right, following the wall, and saw Don Juan sitting against it. I shifted my head to the left in order to focus on the water. I found the bottom of the pan. I raised my head slightly and saw a medium-sized black dog approaching. I saw him coming towards the water. The dog began to drink. I raised my hand to push him away from my water. I focused my pinpoint vision on the dog to carry on the movement, and suddenly I saw him become transparent. The water was a shiny, viscous liquid. I saw it going down the dog's throat into his body. I saw it flowing evenly through his entire length and then shooting out through each one of the hairs. I saw the iridescent fluid traveling along the length of each individual hair and then projecting out of the hairs to form a long, white, silky mane. At that moment I had the sensation of intense convulsions, and in a matter of instants a tunnel formed around me, very low and narrow, hard and strangely cold. It felt to the touch like a wall of solid tinfoil. I found I was sitting on the tunnel floor. I tried to stand up, but hit my head on the metal roof, and the tunnel compressed itself until it was suffocating me. I remember having to crawl toward a son of round point where the tunnel ended. When I finally arrived, if I did, I had forgotten all about the dog, Don Juan, and myself. I was exhausted. My clothes were soaked in a cold, sticky liquid. I rolled back and forth trying to find a position in which to rest, a position where my heart would not pound so hard. In one of those shifts I saw the dog again. Every memory came back to me at once, and suddenly all was clear in my mind. I turned around to look for Don Juan, but I could not distinguish anything or anyone. All I was capable of seeing was the dog becoming iridescent, an intense light radiated from his body. I saw again the water flowing through him, kindling him like a bonfire. I got to the water, sank my face in the pan, and drank with him. My hands were in front of me on the ground and, as I drank, I saw the fluid running through my veins setting up hues of red and yellow and green. I drank more and more. I drank until I was all afire, I was all aglow. I drank until the fluid went out of my body through each pore and projected out like fibers of silk, and I too acquired a long, lustrous, iridescent mane. I looked at the dog and his mane was like mine. A supreme happiness filled my whole body, and we ran together toward a sort of yellow warmth that came from some indefinite place. And there we played. We played and wrestled until I knew his wishes and he knew mine. We took turns manipulating each other in the fashion of a puppet show. I could make him move his legs by twisting my toes, and every time he nodded his head I felt an irresistible impulse to jump. But his most impish act was to make me scratch my head with my foot while I sat. He did it by flapping his ears from side to side. This action was to me utterly, unbearably funny. Such a touch of grace and irony, such mastery, I thought. The euphoria that possessed me was indescribable. I laughed until it was almost impossible to breathe. I had the clear sensation of not being able to open my eyes. I was looking through a tank of water. It was a long and very painful state filled with the anxiety of not being able to wake up and yet being awake. Then slowly the world became clear and in focus. My field of vision became again very round and ample, and with it came an ordinary conscious act, which was to turn around and look for that marvelous being. At this point I encountered the most difficult transition. The passage from my normal state had taken place almost without my realizing it. I was aware, my thoughts and feelings were a corollary of that awareness, and the passing was smooth and clear. But this second change, the awakening to serious, sober consciousness, was genuinely shocking. I had forgotten I was a man. The sadness of such an irreconcilable situation was so intense that I wept. Saturday, August 5, 1961. Later that morning, after breakfast, the owner of the house, Don Juan, and I drove back to Don Juan's place. I was very tired, but I couldn't go to sleep in the truck. Only after the man had left did I fall asleep on the porch of Don Juan's house. When I woke up it was dark. Don Juan had covered me up with a blanket. I looked for him, but he was not in the house. He came later with a pot of fried beans and a stack of tortillas. I was extremely hungry. After we had finished eating and were resting, he asked me to tell him all that had happened to me the night before. I related my experience in great detail and as accurately as possible. When I had finished, he nodded his head and said, "I think you are fine. It is difficult for me to explain now how and why. But I think it went all right for you. You see, sometimes he is playful, like a child, at other times he is terrible, fearsome. He either frolics, or he is dead serious. It is impossible to know beforehand what he will be like with another person. Yet, when one knows him well, sometimes. You played with him tonight. You are the only person I know who has had such an encounter. In what way does my experience differ from that of others? You're not an Indian, therefore it is hard for me to figure out what is what. Yet he either takes people or rejects them, regardless of whether they are Indians or not. That I know. I have seen numbers of them. I also know that he frolics, he makes some people laugh, but never have I seen him play with anyone. Can you tell me now, Don Juan, how does peyote protect?" He did not let me finish. Vigorously he touched me on the shoulder. "Don't you ever name him that way. You haven't seen enough of him yet to know him. How does Mescalito protect people?" He advises. He answers whatever questions you ask. Then Mescalito is real? I mean, he is something you can see? He seemed to be baffled by my question. He looked at me with a sort of blank expression. What I meant to say is that Mescalito. I heard what you said. Didn't you see him last night? I wanted to say that I saw only a dog, but I noticed his bewildered look. Then you think what I saw last night was him? He looked at me with contempt. He chuckled, shook his head as though he couldn't believe it, and in a very belligerent tone he added, "A poco crees que era tu, mama, don't tell me you believe it was your mama?" He paused before saying mama because what he meant to say was tu chingada madre, an idiom used as a disrespectful allusion to the other party's mother. The word mama was so incongruous that we both laughed for a long time. Then I realized he had fallen asleep and had not answered my question. Sunday, August 6, 1961. I drove Don Juan to the house where I had taken peyote. On the way he told me that the name of the man who had offered me to Mescalito was John. When we got to the house we found John sitting on his porch with two young men. All of them were extremely jovial, they laughed and talked with great ease. The three of them spoke English perfectly. I told John that I had come to thank him for having helped me. I wanted to get their views on my behavior during the hallucinogenic experience, and told them I had been trying to think of what I had done that night and that I couldn't remember. They laughed and were reluctant to talk about it. They seemed to be holding back on account of Don Juan. They all glanced at him as though waiting for an affirmative cue to go on. Don Juan must have cued them, although I did not notice anything, because suddenly John began to tell me what I had done that night. He said he knew I had been taken when he heard me puking. He estimated that I must have puked 30 times. Don Juan corrected him and said it was only 10 times. John continued, "Then we all moved next to you. You were stiff, and were having convulsions. For a very long time, while lying on your back, You moved your mouth as though talking. Then you began to bump your head on the floor, and Don Juan put an old hat on your head and you stopped it. You shivered and whined for hours, lying on the floor. I think everybody fell asleep then, but I heard you puffing and groaning in my sleep. Then I heard you scream and I woke up. I saw you leaping up in the air, screaming. You made a dash for the water, knocked the pan over, and began to swim in the puddle. Don Juan brought you more water. You sat quietly in front of the pan. Then you jumped up and took off all your clothes. You were kneeling in front of the water, drinking in big gulps. Then you just sat there and stared into space. We thought you were going to be there forever. Nearly everybody was asleep, including Don Juan, when suddenly you jumped up again, howling, and took after the dog. The dog got scared and howled too, and ran to the back of the house. Then everybody woke up. We all got up. You came back from the other side still chasing the dog. The dog was running ahead of you barking and howling. I think you must have gone 20 times around the house, running in circles, barking like a dog. I was afraid people were going to be curious. There are no neighbors close, but your howling was so loud it could have been heard for miles. One of the young men added, you caught up with the dog and brought it to the porch in your arms. John continued, then you began to play with the dog. You wrestled with him, and the dog and you bit each other and played. That, I thought, was funny. My dog does not play usually. But this time you and the dog were rolling on each other. Then you ran to the water and the dog drank with you, the young man said. You ran 5 or 6 times to the water with the dog. How long did this go on? I asked. Hours, John said. At one time we lost sight of you too. I think you must have run to the back. We just heard you barking and groaning. You sounded so much like a dog that we couldn't tell you two apart. Maybe it was just the dog alone, I said. They laughed, and John said, you were barking there, boy. What happened next? The 3 men looked at one another and seemed to have a hard time deciding what happened next. Finally the young man who had not yet said anything spoke up. He choked, he said, looking at John. Yes, you certainly choked. You began to cry very strangely, and then you fell to the floor. We thought you were biting your tongue. Don Juan opened your jaws and poured water on your face. Then you started shivering and having convulsions all over again. Then you stayed motionless for a long time. Don Juan said it was all over. By then it was morning, so we covered you with a blanket and left you to sleep on the porch. He stopped there and looked at the other men who were obviously trying not to laugh. He turned to Don Juan and asked him something. Don Juan smiled and answered the question. John turned to me and said, we left you here on the porch because we were afraid you were going to piss all over the rooms. They all laughed very loudly. What was the matter with me? I asked. Did you? John son of mimicked me. We were not going to mention it, but Don Juan says it is all right. You pissed all over my dog. What did I do? You don't think the dog was running because he was afraid of you, do you? The dog was running because you were pissing on him. There was general laughter at this point. I tried to question one of the young men, but they were all laughing and he didn't hear me. John went on, my dog got even though, he pissed on you too. This statement was apparently utterly funny because they all roared with laughter, including Don Juan. When they had quieted down, I asked in all earnestness, is it really true? This really happened? Still laughing, John replied, I swear my dog really pissed on you. Driving back to Don Juan's place I asked him, did all that really happen, Don Juan? Yes, he said, but they don't know what you saw. They don't realize you were playing with him. That is why I did not disturb you. But is this business of the dog and me pissing on each other true? It was not a dog. How many times do I have to tell you that? This is the only way to understand it. It's the only way. It was he who played with you. Did you know all this was happening before I told you about it? He vacillated for an instant before answering. No, I remembered, after you told me about it, the strange way you looked. I just suspected you were doing fine because you didn't seem scared. Did the dog really play with me as they say? God damn it. It was not a dog. Thursday, August 17, 1969. I told Don Juan how I felt about my experience. From the point of view of my intended work, it had been a disastrous event. I said I did not care for another similar encounter with Mescalito. I agreed that everything that had happened to me had been more than interesting, but added that nothing in it could really move me towards seeking it again. I seriously believed that I was not constructed for that type of endeavor. Peyote had produced in me, as a post-reaction, a strange kind of physical discomfort. It was an indefinite fear or unhappiness, a melancholy of some sort, which I could not define exactly. And I did not find that state noble in any way. Don Juan laughed and said, "You are beginning to learn. This type of learning is not for me. I am not made for it, Don Juan. You always exaggerate." This is not exaggeration. It is. The only trouble is that you exaggerate the bad points only. There are no good points so far as I am concerned. All I know is that it makes me afraid. There is nothing wrong with being afraid. When you fear, you see things in a different way. But I don't care about seeing things in a different way, Don Juan. I think I am going to leave the learning about Mescalito alone. I can't handle it, Don Juan. This is really a bad situation for me. Of course it is bad, even for me. You are not the only one who is baffled. Why should you be baffled, Don Juan? I have been thinking about what I saw the other night. Mescalito actually played with you. That baffled me, because it was an indication, omen. What kind of indication, Don Juan? Mescalito was pointing you out to me. What for? It wasn't clear to me then, but now it is. He meant you were the chosen man, Escogido. Mescalito pointed you out to me, and by doing that he told me you were the chosen man. Do you mean I was chosen among others for some task, or something of the sort? No. What I mean is, Mescalito told me you could be the man I am looking for. When did he tell you that, Don Juan? By playing with you, he told me that. This makes you the chosen man for me. What does it mean to be the chosen man? There are some secrets I know, tengo secretos. I have secrets I won't be able to reveal to anyone unless I find my chosen man. The other night when I saw you playing with Mescalito, it was clear to me you were that man. But you are not an Indian. How baffling. But what does it mean to me, Don Juan? What do I have to do? I've made up my mind, and I am going to teach you the secrets that make up the lot of a man of knowledge. Do you mean the secrets about Mescalito? Yes, but those are not all the secrets I know. There are others, of a different kind, which I would like to give to someone. I had a teacher myself, my benefactor, and I also became his chosen man upon performing a certain feat. He taught me all I know. I asked him again what this new role would require of me. He said learning was the only thing involved, learning in the sense of what I had experienced in the 2 sessions with him. The way in which the situation had evolved was quite strange. I had made up my mind to tell him I was going to give up the idea of learning about peyote, and then before I could really make my point, he offered to teach me his knowledge. I did not know what he meant by that, but I felt that this sudden turn was very serious. I argued I had no qualifications for such a task, as it required a rare kind of courage which I did not have. I told him that my bent of character was to talk about acts others performed. I wanted to hear his views and opinions about everything. I told him I could be happy if I could sit there and listen to him talk for days. To me, that would be learning. He listened without interrupting me. I talked for a long time. Then he said, "All this is very easy to understand. Fear is the first natural enemy a man must overcome on his path to knowledge. Besides, you are curious. That evens up the score. And you will learn in spite of yourself, that's the rule. I protested for a while longer, trying to dissuade him. But he seemed to be convinced there was nothing else I could do but learn. You are not thinking in the proper order, he said. Mescalito actually played with you. That's the point to think about. Why don't you dwell on that instead of on your fear? Was it so unusual? You are the only person I have ever seen playing with him. You are not used to this kind of life, therefore the indications, omens, bypass you. Yet you are a serious person, but your seriousness is attached to what you do, not to what goes on outside you. You dwell upon yourself too much. That's the trouble. And that produces a terrible fatigue. But what else can anyone do, Don Juan? Seek and see the marvels all around you. You will get tired of looking at yourself alone, and that fatigue will make you deaf and blind to everything else. You have a point, Don Juan, but how can I change? Think about the wonder of Mescalito playing with you. Think about nothing else, the rest will come to you of itself. Sunday, August 20th, 1961. Last night Don Juan proceeded to usher me into the realm of his knowledge. We sat in front of his house in the dark. Suddenly, after a long silence, he began to talk. He said he was going to advise me with the same words his own benefactor had used the first day he took him as his apprentice. Don Juan had apparently memorized the words, for he repeated them several times, to make sure I did not miss any. A man goes to knowledge as he goes to war, wide awake, with fear, with respect, and with absolute assurance. Going to knowledge or going to war in any other manner is a mistake, and whoever makes it will live to regret his steps. I asked him why was it so, and he said that when a man has fulfilled those 4 requisites there are no mistakes for which he will have to account. Under such conditions his acts lose the blundering quality of a fool's acts. If such a man fails, or suffers a defeat, he will have lost only a battle, and there will be no pitiful regrets over that. Then he said he intended to teach me about an ally in the very same way his own benefactor had taught him. He put strong emphasis on the words very same way, repeating the phrase several times. An ally, he said, is a power a man can bring into his life to help him, advise him, and give him the strength necessary to perform acts, whether big or small, right or wrong. This ally is necessary to enhance a man's life, guide his acts, and further his knowledge. In fact, an ally is the indispensable aid to knowing. Don Juan said this with great conviction and force. He seemed to choose his words carefully. He repeated the following sentence 4 times. An ally will make you see and understand things about which no human being could possibly enlighten you. Is an ally something like a guardian spirit? It is neither a guardian nor a spirit. It is an aid. Is Mescalito your ally? No. Mescalito is another kind of power. A unique power. A protector, a teacher. What makes Mescalito different from an ally? He can't be tamed and used as an ally is tamed and used. Mescalito is outside oneself. He chooses to show himself in many forms to whoever stands in front of him, regardless of whether that person is a brujo or a farm boy. Don Juan spoke with deep fervor about Mescalito's being the teacher of the proper way to live. I asked him how Mescalito taught the proper way of life, and Don Juan replied that Mescalito showed how to live. How does he show it? I asked. He has many ways of showing it. Sometimes he shows it on his hand, or on the rocks, or the trees, or just in front of you. Is it like a picture in front of you? No. It is a teaching in front of you. Does Mescalito talk to the person? Yes. But not in words. How does he talk, then? He talks differently to every man. I felt my questions were annoying him. I did not ask any more. He went on explaining that there were no exact steps to knowing Mescalito, Therefore no one could teach about him except Mescalito himself. This quality made him a unique power. He was not the same for every man. On the other hand, the acquiring of an ally required, Don Juan said, the most precise teaching and the following of stages or steps without a single deviation. There are many such ally powers in the world, he said, but he was familiar with only 2 of them. And he was going to lead me to them and their secrets, but it was up to me to choose one of them, for I could have only one. His benefactor's ally was in La Yerba del Diablo, devil's weed, he said, but he personally did not like it, even though his benefactor had taught him its secrets. His own ally was in the humido, the little smoke, he said, but he did not elaborate on the nature of the smoke. I asked him about it. He remained quiet. After a long pause I asked him, "What kind of a power is an ally?" "It is an aid. I have already told you." "How does it aid?" "An ally is a power capable of carrying a man beyond the boundaries of himself. This is how an ally can reveal matters no human being could." "But Mescalito also takes you out of the boundaries of yourself. Doesn't that make him an ally?" "No. Mescalito takes you out of yourself to teach you. An ally takes you out to give you power." I asked him to explain this point to me in more detail, or to describe the difference in effect between the 2. He looked at me for a long time and laughed. He said that learning through conversation was not only a waste, but stupidity, because learning was the most difficult task a man could undertake. He asked me to remember the time I had tried to find my spot, and how I wanted to find it without doing any work because I had expected him to hand out all the information. If he had done so, he said, I would never have learned. But, knowing how difficult it was to find my spot, and, above all, knowing that it existed, would give me a unique sense of confidence. He said that while I remained rooted to my good spot nothing could cause me bodily harm, because I had the assurance that at that particular spot I was at my very best. I had the power to shove off anything that might be harmful to me. If, however, he had told me where it was, I would never have had the confidence needed to claim it as true knowledge. Thus, knowledge was indeed power. Don Juan said then that every time a man sets himself to learn he has to labor as hard as I did to find that spot, and the limits of his learning are determined by his own nature. Thus he saw no point in talking about knowledge. He said that certain kinds of knowledge were too powerful for the strength I had, and to talk about them would only bring harm to me. He apparently felt there was nothing else he wanted to say. He got up and walked towards his house. I told him the situation overwhelmed me. It was not what I had conceived or wanted it to be. He said that fears are natural, that all of us experience them and there is nothing we can do about it. But on the other hand, no matter how frightening learning is, it is more terrible to think of a man without an ally, or without knowledge.